All right, excellent. Thank you very much, everyone. I think Amos, we're good to go. I'll hand over to Amos Hadebe from Nedbank. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter. Good morning, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Amos Hadebe, and I am the Executive Head for Group Stakeholder Relations and Public Affairs at Nedbank. And on behalf of Nedbank Senior Leadership, it is a privilege and a great honor to welcome you all to our first Nedbank and NBF Networking Forum session, which is our first in 2022. I am with my co-host and our longtime partner, Peter Varndell, who is the CEO of the NBF. A special welcome to our esteemed guests, speakers, panelists, and our moderator, of which Peter will introduce shortly. Perhaps, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, to give you a brief background on the objectives of this Nedbank and NBF Networking Forum. This is a private sector-led initiative that started about 11 years ago in 2011. It is a platform whereby senior government and business leaders get together and deliberate on topical issues that are related to the NEPAD objectives and the growth of the African continent. We normally host these sessions quarterly at our offices in Sandton. However, due to the COVID restrictions in the past 2 years, we were forced to move online as we are doing today. And with the state of disaster having come to an end effective today, we hope that the next session in the next quarter we will hold
Amos, you froze on our side, unfortunately.
Of regional importance. Talking of issues of regional importance, I'm sure you will agree with me, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, that today's topic, which is expanding digital readiness and supporting digital infrastructure in the SADC region, is of regional importance. And we look forward to our esteemed speakers and presenters to unpack this exciting topic, and hopefully we are going to hear from you, our audience, to engage with the topic and with our speakers. In conclusion, before handing over to Peter to formally introduce our speakers and panelists and to set the scene of today's session, I would like to leave you with a quote by a Nigerian British entrepreneur by the name of Bozan Tijani, who said, and I quote, "Digital infrastructure will power the future we collectively desire for Africa, and we must be intentional about its ownership." Close quote. With that said, I'd like to hand over to Peter. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hadebe, and thank you very much for the partnership, which we strongly value. We really do believe that these sessions that we host together with yourselves can be instrumental in forming programs and projects that can have an impact and make a difference in things that are important to business. Just a very warm welcome to all of those that have joined us today. A special welcome to our colleagues from the public sector, from Outer NEPAD, Dr. Tuwela Jere, a very warm welcome. From the SADC Secretariat, Dr. Archu, very glad to have you with us. All our colleagues, Amos Hadebe and team from the Nedbank side, again, just to reiterate how pleased we are with this partnership, and thank you for supporting us in getting this session going. A warm welcome to the NEPAD Business Foundation Chairman and the Board of Directors that have joined us today. A very big thank you and welcome to Harsha Desai from Deloitte, who's going to be facilitating for us today. Harsha has been very much involved in digital programs before. I know certainly I've worked at the World Economic Forum level, so her knowledge will be hugely valuable for us today. So thank you for joining us. And then just to acknowledge all the speakers, presenters, knowledge partners that are going to be sharing their thoughts with us today. We'll introduce you as we get through the program, but thank you very much again for your time and for assisting us in this topic. And then very most importantly, all of you that have joined us today, all the participants that have joined on. I see we've got about 50 odd that have joined and many more that are getting added as we proceed. So thank you very much. Just to very quickly, I'm going to share a presentation with you from a NEP-NBF perspective. So just very briefly, to give you a bit of a background, this is a new area for us as the NEPAD Business Foundation. So I'm sure that there are many of you that have joined today that are not familiar with us. So fundamentally, we're a non-profit organization that coordinates private sector efforts aimed at Africa's economic growth and development. How we do this is we create programs to support public sector endorsed plans and projects by mobilizing private sector resources. What that means is we strongly believe in the concept of political will. So we want to work on things that governments themselves see as priorities, but where priorities then align with the interests of private sector, where they see programs or initiatives that will help to grow their businesses, they see as opportunities, or that can manage some form of business risk. We are very proud to be celebrating our 20 years of existence this year. We were formed in 2002. At that point to support the NEPAD initiative, but obviously that has grown over the years. We have many programs that either support the African Union, the outer NEPAD, SADC, also at a South African level, the Department of Water, Presidency, Public Works, and then we do dive into more specific level where it could be with municipalities, agencies and countries, etc. So the model still remains the same, but we seek to support private sector stakeholders by mobilizing private sector. It's a bit of a busy slide, but just we've been doing some work recently on repositioning what the NBF is all about to align with the topical global issues of the time. So we work on matters of climate change and green transition, which is primarily focused on supporting Southern Africa to reach its NDCs or to deal with the carbon issues. We work on water security and water resilience, as well as the circular economy. We work on trade facilitation, and we're very proud to host the SADC Business Council, which is being very active in that space. We do work in health and pharmaceutical value chains, strategic trade corridors, as well as agricultural value chains. And then very importantly, we are now looking to add digital transition into our portfolio. And this discussion today is our first foray into what we hope to form as a digital working group that can start to action some of the key activities that are required to unlock the digital transition. Just to give you an idea of where today's session fits in, we very much try to coin this phrase of ideas to action. And the Nedbank-NBF Networking Forum is part of the ideas part of what we do. We try to get together groups of common stakeholders to understand issues around particular sectors. From there, we develop, it could be feasibility studies or position papers or policy papers or concept notes. And from there, we take it through to action. So we are very active in projects like the North-South Corridor, which is looking at transaction advisory to get rolling stock and equipment into that rail corridor, as well as things like the Polokwane Water Partnership, which is actively supporting the municipality to solve non-revenue water issues. And then just finally under action, we are very proud to have received awards for many of our partnerships. But just to give you an idea of where this all fits in, just again, for the benefit of others, I wanted to touch briefly on our last two Nedbank networking forums. Our last one was on Infrastructure South Africa. We've done a lot of engagement with key sectors subsequently, and we identified some of the major infrastructure users in South Africa specifically. Their challenges relate to rail, ports, and water. And through that, we've been creating some initiatives. The first being scaling up our water municipality, non-revenue water partnerships in South Africa that will mimic the Polokwane Water Partnership that has been successfully executed. We're establishing a multi-sectoral rail working group, and we're also supporting efficiency improvement projects at Durban Port. So that we're pleased to have reported that progress. And then the second one before that was on advancing transmission lines in Southern Africa. And the key update here from this was that we are now working actively with the SADC Secretariat, the Southern Africa Power Pool, the Regional Energy Regulators Association of Southern Africa, in activities that include the regional grid code development, supporting the establishment of the Regional Transmission Fund, and then engaging on specific transmission projects that we are busy with, that are active in the region, to see how we can support the execution of those. So that's where we hope today will go. We'll have a new topic in digital, but we foresee it becoming a program of the NBF going forward. That's all I really wanted to share with you in introduction. And at this point, it's my pleasure to hand over to Harsha Desai, Associate Director at Deloitte, to guide us through the program today. Thank you, Harsha.
Good morning, and thank you so much for all the introduction, Peter. And thank you, colleagues, for joining today's discussion. I trust everyone has a better understanding of the purpose based on the overview provided by Peter of the forum. Please, let me just encourage you, if you are still joining, make sure you introduce yourself on the chat, just your name, the organization, and the role that you're playing in the space. It'll really help in this virtual world for us to stay connected and network in the space. So let's start the session with some good news and demonstrate the practicality of what today's discussion potentially can inspire. On Friday, Google landed the submarine cable in Togo, the first nation in West Africa to now have 5G connectivity, commercial connectivity services in the region. This subsea cable is part of Google's 1 billion rand program to build digital capacity in the region, and will seek to connect the 8 million people of Togo, but actually the conduit will land in Nigeria, Namibia, and South Africa later, linking Africa to Europe via Portugal. The new cable is expected to help Togo double its internet speeds by 2025 and reduce internet prices by about 14%, according to the research from the Africa Practice and Genesis Analytics. What we're seeing is that, according to the digital transformation strategy for Africa developed by the African Union, it is expected that the digital transformation will not thrive unless we're able to be self-sustaining in the absence of four key foundational pillars. Firstly, an enabling environment in terms of policy and regulation. Secondly, digital infrastructure. Thirdly, digital skills and an available workforce. And lastly, digital innovation and entrepreneurship. We are seeing that several sustainable development goals require information and communication technologies as an enabler, notably to achieve universal identification, more efficient delivery of government services, financial inclusion, and job creation. Furthermore, digital transformation will impact key sectors of the economy, such as health, agriculture, education, and trade, among others. In terms of the overall investment, ICT compromises a moderately small portion of what Africa's total infrastructure spend will be. According to the African Development Bank, it is estimated that dealing with the continent's infrastructure needs will see an annual cost of approximately between 130 to 170 billion until 2025. Of this, only 4 billion to 7 billion will be need to put aside for the ICT sector. However, to fully bridge the current digital divide over the next 20 years, the Global Infrastructure Facility suggests that physical infrastructure will require a financing gap to be plugged that equates to approximately $1.7 trillion. The pandemic has demonstrated the massive leaps that business, government, and civil society made during the crisis, and that sustaining this level of focus and momentum can boost economic growth, especially as the region looks within to reap the fruits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Digital transformation is no longer something we're anticipating. It is here with us, and it is here to stay. It has become so ubiquitous that some of the transitions we've made as a globalized society has seemingly been undertaken undetected. Today's discussion aims to explore the mechanisms through which stakeholders can collaborate to close the digital infrastructure gap in the region, starting with an overview of the region's digital readiness by Charmaine, and then looking at areas where there's innovation in African economies by Dr. Lucian. We will then have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Tuela on the region's digital transformation strategy and Dr. Thew on the SADC's infrastructure strategy, giving us a basis on which to build our response. We will then get an update on current initiatives from the World Bank before we engage with some of our business stakeholders on the implementation challenges and opportunities to support the development of the financing of digital infrastructure. We then look forward to engaging with the wider group, all of you on the call today, through a discussion. Please take the opportunity to pose questions on the platform. And without any further delay, let me hand over to Charmaine, the Government Affairs Director from Cisco, to share some insights on the results of the Digital Readiness Index. Thank you, Charmaine. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Harsha. And
thanks, Harsha. Charmaine, you're on. I think.
I am. Yes, I am on.
Charmaine, you're on mute on your side.
You can hear Charmaine, Peter.
Oh, it's my speaker.
Yeah, I can hear.
Peter, can you hear me now, Peter?
Okay, try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sorry. Apologies, that was entirely my fault. I had my laptop on mute and it was entirely my fault. Maybe just to introduce Charmaine, we're very pleased to have Cisco with us today. Just for a bit of background of why we've deliberately invited Cisco is that when the NEPAD Business Foundation, probably about 18 months ago, started to look at what we saw as the new priority areas that we should be focusing on, we had identified digital as key. And in doing so, we started to do our investigations into what was available out there. We were very much guided by something called the Digital Readiness Index report done by Cisco. And we were very grateful for that because it gave us quite a good snapshot of where we were, Southern Africa as a region. So I'd love to hear from you, Charmaine, about what is this Digital Readiness Index and why has Cisco been doing this, why it's so important to you. So over.
Thank you so much, Peter. So in essence, we've actually moved in terms of quite a number of reports. So we actually started with the country's internet reporting. So we started reporting on what, and I think Harsha made such a brilliant point in the opening, just around the different aspects that are required for governments, for countries, I think for communities, and I guess just continents as a whole to actually ensure that they embrace, the digital different pillars, just to ensure that countries and communities are actually successful. So we moved from a country's internet awareness report, looking at what are the different aspects that countries need to embrace in terms of full connectivity. And based on research that went backwards and forwards between us, our partners and stakeholders, we wanted to better understand a country's digital readiness, just so that we could give a lot of the governments that we work with in our partner ecosystem that we work with insight into specific investments and interventions that could help the country move up in terms of its digital journey. And I think where this report has helped us a great deal, just in terms of spotlighting in the different countries, and I think the different governments, what was needed, just in terms of socioeconomic development, we actually looked at how does the digital economy actually contribute to the overall GDP. And so we did some research just to gain a bit of understanding of what it means to be digital ready. So we often hear lots of countries come up with some of the most brilliant and amazing policies. I myself have been in the ICT sector for over 3 decades, and I've been fortunate enough to be part of some of the most amazing cohorts and commissions and councils looking at policies. But I think where the digital index report goes a bit more, we actually use these insights just in terms of how we collaborate and partner with governments to drive skills awareness, but I think most importantly as well, to guide us in terms of investment. So we go into countries and we roll out Cisco's Networking Academy program, where over 2 million students worldwide gain very critical foundational knowledge and also digital and entrepreneurship skills to actually improve and take advantage of the opportunities that technology can bring. And we also work with global problem solvers in terms of how do we empower these innovators and designers better. And I think a lot of this research that we get around the spectrums of what is needed in that particular country for us to invest and move the needle. And that's something that we did in South Africa with the Departments of Communications and Digital Technologies, as well as the presidency. When we met with these teams, we actually presented our findings from the digital index report. And this is where we knew exactly as Cisco and our partners where to invest in that particular country.
Apologies.
Peter, okay, there you go.
Apologies. And what did you find, Charmaine? I mean, and typically, what are the, in terms of indexes and all the different aspects of the components that you look at, what did you find in Southern Africa? Typically, how ready are we?
So it's very interesting, again, in terms of how the pillars are actually rated. We actually look at, a digital index just in terms of how does a country actually invest in terms of its human capital, its technology adoption. And I think overall, South Africa actually ranked 78 out of 82 countries on the Digital Readiness Index. And a newcomer, actually very interesting for me, when I actually went through the report, a newcomer for us was Botswana, which was actually slightly ahead of South Africa's ranking. And in South Africa, where we actually, needed to pick up in terms of our scorings was in terms of technology adoption. So how easily does the country actually relate to adopting different types of technology? I served in the President's 4IR Commission, and we looked at various aspects around how we can better integrate a lot of the 4IR technology like AI, machine learning. How do we look at IoT in terms of changing communities, in terms of changing countries? But I think, again, a big issue that we're finding is that we talk a lot about this technology, but we don't readily in South Africa unpack what it means to the ordinary man on the street. So if I am running an AI center, how do I use AI to ensure digital inclusion? How do I use it to ensure job creation? We often use these terms, and we're finding in South Africa, many people are quite overwhelmed with, well, the technology is here, how does it move me forward? Again, in terms of digital readiness, in terms of the startup environment, we're still very low in terms of startups. So we're finding that not enough of these startup companies are getting the capital invested in them to be able to actually stack up to the larger players. And even in terms of technical infrastructure, we scored quite low, 1.06 out of 4. Startup environment, 0.67 out of 4. So those scores are very low when we look at, especially when the National Development Plan 2030 for South Africa is actually saying to us that for us to actually improve in terms of our GDP, we need more of the jobs that must be created by SMMEs and by startups. And we're seeing that whilst a McKinsey report actually says that 88% of the country's income will actually start to depend on our innovators and startups, they're not always getting the necessary funding, the necessary startup capital, the necessary, competitive angle that they actually do require. And we actually saw it even recently in terms of the much needed and awaited spectrum that came in and that was actually awarded. Again, I think it was very telling in that it's a lot of SMMEs and a lot of the small businesses that were not necessarily included, I think, in terms of that spectrum allocation. And I think the good news, though, I think in terms of not just South Africa, but the continent as a whole, what I'm starting to see more and more during lockdown, I think COVID really shone a very bright light in terms of the fact that at some point in time, every company, every government, we all have to embrace digitization. And we're starting to see that more and more companies and more countries are starting to look at collaborations with many private entities, and they're trying to figure out, how do they keep up with the digital technologies which are advancing at such a rapid space? And we're starting to see that more and more people are being connected around the world. And even this very conference, I think, Peter, that's happening from a virtual or hybrid perspective, we're starting to see that people are seeking greater knowledge, services, and resources as a result of these technological advancements. And we're starting to also see how the impact of things like automation and artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, they're starting to make an appearance in our everyday lives. And, I think, again, for us to even start to be talking about all of these things and what benefits they yield, we need to understand a country's digital readiness for us to start to even create that more inclusive future for everyone and not just for a few.
Never quite get used to it, do you? Thanks, Charmaine, for sharing that. And I think you touched already a bit on what impact we've had in COVID in the last few years and how this has become more and more topical. I think we don't need to preach that to everybody. I think we're all very aware of that. And maybe just from our side, what we picked out from your report is that we're very grateful that report covered 12 of the 16 countries in the SADC area, and some very good insights that I'm sure that we can unpack in a lot more detail. Particularly putting a pin in that for our colleagues from out of NEPAD and from SADC Secretariat. That would be a great starting point for them in understanding. We very much took a technology infrastructure view of it, but like you say, there are many different aspects to digital readiness which you need to work on all at one go. Charmaine, your view, what is it the private sector can do? How would you advise the private sector participates, shapes and molds the future of digital? What would be your guidance and what is Cisco doing in this space?
So I think something that we've actually started for all the startups who have joined the core, Peter, we have quite a number of Cisco Edge centers. So if you go online and you just Google Cisco Edge, you'll see that we have a number of centers that are actually, again, what we did, we went to the Departments of Communication and Digital Technologies, and we actually asked them, where do you see the greatest need in terms of South Africa? And they guided us through, well, a big need for them is to focus on small, medium, macro enterprises. How can we as Cisco then expose these startups and businesses to the world of technology? So we have 3 edge centers, and basically the definition for edge is actually experience, it's design, it's go to market and earn. And basically that's the lens at which we're looking at working with these SMMEs. So how do we co-design some of the technological and digitization experiences with them? So different types of centers. So we've got one in Pretoria at the Innovation Hub. We've got another one at the Dubai Trade Port Center in Durban. We've just recently launched one in collaboration with the East London Incubation Center. And basically what we do is we bring in different SMMEs into this environment. They also have access, by the way, globally to Cisco rare skill and technology experts, where they can actually help co-design and collaborate different solutions. We have one in Lagos in Nigeria. We also have one in Nairobi in Kenya. So we bring in different experts and we help co-design and collaborate around some of the more cutting edge sort of IoT, cybersecurity, etc. technologies. So those are actually quite handy if the startups and SMEs want to just go and Google Cisco Edge Centers and find out more about those. And I think the key focus for us is on building capable SMMEs and ensuring that these small, medium, micro enterprises who want to better discover the world of technology have the resources at their doorstep. The second thing that we've actually done is we've sort of co-integrated into these edge centers the Cisco Networking Academy package. And basically the Cisco Networking Academy package is a global sort of classroom integrated learning that helps a lot of the entrepreneurs, SMMEs, and even just people in the workplace to actually get that edge up in terms of the skills of the future. So what are those skills that a lot of companies are thinking about or have not yet thought about? We start to put the envelope on those. So we push the envelope around IoT, around entrepreneurship, we start to look at how do we better design for AI, how do we actually design networks, etc. So for anyone interested in the tech world, that's a great step up just in terms of online or even in person. We've got about roughly 82 centers across South Africa that are actually looking specifically at designing the different sort of skills of the future. And I think the last one that we just rolled out on the 22nd of March, or the 23rd of March in Germiston, we've actually collaborated with the National Library Centre for us to actually roll out and convert these paper libraries into digital libraries. So we've trained librarians, again, on the digital skills, just so that those communities have a digital sort of edge and not just paper-based. So I think these are some of the things that we're actually doing that come to mind immediately in terms of the work that we're doing with government. Over and above, I think some of the stuff that we also heard from a policy perspective from Harsha. We also do work around, how do we drive thought leadership? How do we embrace a hybrid world model, etc. So there are these things that we're driving from a private-public sector partnership, and it's not again just with us. Our model largely globally is through partners, so we are working with partners in this regard as well, Peter.
Thanks very much, Charmaine. So again, I think it's important for us to understand, what you are doing already, so that we can scale these types of initiatives, coordinate these types of initiatives, so we can achieve more. I think this is a Cisco story, and I'm sure there's many others that are doing similar type of work at a corporate level. And it's fantastic work, which is great, and thank you for that. Just Charmaine, anything you think that governments themselves can do that can enable a little bit more? Any thoughts on specific requests that you would have as Cisco for governments to enable this?
Again, we're quite fortunate in that globally we work very, very closely with governments. And I think a big focus of mine across the continent is working with government leaders, just in terms of accelerating their digitization journey. I think something that we find that I bump across on a regular basis, firstly, is that government's ability to readily embrace digitization. I think had it not been for COVID, and we all know the joke that it's not the CIO or the CTO or the CEO who actually advanced the sort of digital acceleration, it was actually COVID. And I think even during lockdown, prior to the hard lockdown, we went out to various governments offering different platforms, just as other companies did. I know it wasn't just Cisco, but we went out to a number of world leaders and we said to them, we are going to get to a point of hard lockdown. And the only thing we can do as private sector and government is better collaborate. So we made Cisco WebEx collaborating technology openly and freely available, just so that governments could stay connected. And so, Peter, that everyone knew when to mute and unmute, and taught them a lot of, brought them online, just so we could accelerate and not have this lockdown where no one was just stuck in a vacuum and we could continue communicating. So I think one of the areas that we are seeing is that a lot of our governments on the continent are very slow to adapt and adopt to this sort of partnership and collaboration. Some are much quicker off the back, like your Botswana, for example, who grabbed this opportunity and said, how do we collaborate? How do we improve the ease of doing business in this country? What are some of the aspects in terms of the important digital segments that we can embrace? A second one, and I think Harsha touched on it, was just in terms of skills development and acceleration. So I think we're finding that countries who have not addressed skills adoption and acceleration, whose citizens are not digital natives, are the countries that are really struggling, Peter, to come to the table. They don't have inclusiveness and diversity when it comes to true digital adoption. And I think a third one is a lot of the countries that I work with, the heads of states I work with across the continent, have some of the most beautifully laid policies and plans. They've spent sufficient time with consultants and investing in how these plans should look. But I think all we need, and I think Harsha or Amos, as somebody touched on, the digital will, Peter. How do we then have that digital will to begin to work with the multitude and of ecosystems, from academia to citizens, to private sector and public sector, to start to roll out and implement some of these beautifully drafted and clearly drafted policies. So I think for me, it's a combination of adopting the skills, leaning in a bit more to collaborate and partner. And the last one is just in terms of how do we then ensure that these beautiful plans are actually implemented and adopted into the different communities.
Thanks very much, Charmaine. So, I mean, we've already engaged with you previously to this call. I learned a lot then. I've learned a lot more today in the preparations, and I think there's so much more we still can learn in sculpting. You know, is there a role for us to play, and how can we support? So, we look forward to coming back to you on that. We unfortunately do need to move on the program. Just any last thoughts from your side before I hand back to Harsha?
So nothing for me, thank you, Peter. Just finally, the next digital report, the readiness report, the index, should be coming out later this year or early next year. So look out for that. And I'll also just ensure that I share it with you, Peter, so you can then share it with the rest of the continent, just in terms of where we are standing right now.
Perfect. Charmaine, thanks again very much for your time. We really appreciate the effort that you put into this, and we look forward to working with you on this program going forward. So at this point, I'm going to hand back to Harsha Desai to continue the rest of the program. Thank you, Harsha.
Thanks so much, Peter and Charmaine. Charmaine, I see your colleague Alfie is also on the call, so I'm going to pose a question that maybe we can bring up in the discussion later. I think it'll be really good to hear a little bit more about these Centers for the Edge, if I got the name correct, and around the growth of the SMMEs that you're supporting in these centers. So please, if you can maybe, Alfie or Charmaine, if you want to elaborate on that in the discussion section later, that would be fantastic. Let me now take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Toela who's our head economic integration division at our NEPAD, and who will be sharing with us the digital transformation strategy for Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Toela. Colleagues, please, as Dr. Toela presents, kindly post questions for the speaker on the chat, and we'll definitely be looking to pick these up as she concludes her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harsha, and good morning to everyone. Before I start my talk on the digital strategy for Africa, just to pick up on what Charmaine was saying about the Cisco networking academies, and to really attest, I think, to the difference that they have made. For me personally, in another life, in another time, more than 15 years ago, I was actually involved with that program and helping to actually establish Cisco networking academies. So definitely a very useful way of helping to build capacity and skills across the continent. So having said that, I would just like to take time maybe just to share a little bit about the digital transformation strategy for Africa, a few perspectives in terms of what AUD and NEPAD is doing, and then maybe also just talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that exist for private sector. So I think, Harsha, you did a good job in terms of outlining what the various pillars are for the strategy itself. The ambitions are huge in terms of being able to create a single digital market for the continent by 2030. Attendant with that, of course, comes issues around affordable access to ICT services, and then also being able to use ICTs and digital infrastructure to support and enhance the free movement of goods, people, and services across the continent. So the four pillars, as you outlined very clearly, the policy and regulation, the infrastructure itself, the skills and capacity, and then issues around innovation and entrepreneurship. I think it's also important, perhaps in the context of this discussion, to highlight the fact that the way the African Union has structured the strategy and has structured the way that it works is that the African Union Commission is responsible for providing the overall policy frameworks and strategies that guide the development of ICTs across the continent. The African Union Development Agency, which I represent, is responsible for implementation, but that implementation happens through the regional economic communities and member states. So you basically have to have all those three layers working together. So I think even in the context of this meeting, it's good that AUD and NEPAD is here, and SADC as well is here to offer perspectives in terms of how we approach the implementation of our various projects and initiatives. So the strategy has gone so far as to identify critical sectors that the continent would focus on and that would form part of the overarching work as far as the move towards a digital single market for Africa. And these are not, I think they're not unique in a way, but I think they give us a way of being able to see how do we actually work together with the various stakeholders in order to achieve the desired objectives. So the ICT as an industry itself is a key priority. So we want to make sure that we're able to leverage capacities across the continent in terms of being able to build components, being able to actually enable African entrepreneurs to build devices, build gadgets, and to be actual active participants in the economy, moving away from over-reliance on imported technologies, but being able to actually manufacture these things locally on the continent ourselves. Trade and financial services, another very key industry or sector that has been identified. And I think we can all attest to the fact that we see a lot of innovation, especially in fintech. I think a lot of that is happening. At the moment, with the coming in of trading under the Continental Free Trade Area, the ability for us to be able to fully and end-to-end across the continent utilize digital services in terms of carrying out trade is again a very important aspect of Africa's digital strategy. Then we are looking at things like services, and these services have to do with, for instance, government to government, government to citizen, government to business, business to business services. And again, looking at how do we actually make sure that we are able to deliver those services effectively and efficiently and affordably using our various technologies and platforms. And then lastly, the various sectors that drive socioeconomic development. So when we look at issues around education, agriculture, health, a lot of opportunities there in terms of how we will actually use digitalization. And I think much has been said about how COVID has forced us to move in that direction, but at the same time, noting the fact that in a lot of countries, there's still work that needs to be done to make sure that children are still able to go to school, even in conditions that we face under COVID-19, for instance. And then we have the cross-cutting issues that look at content and applications. I think we've always lamented the fact that a lot of our content online is not local content, is not locally produced, and is not aimed at local consumers. And we need to make sure that we are able to empower our young people, our innovators, our creatives to actually develop content and applications that speak to us not only in terms of our culture, but also in terms of our languages as well. Then we have issues around digital identification, because to be a participant in the economy that is driven by digital, it is important that one is able to actually have that way of being able to be identified, but also to be able to then participate effectively. So that's also another area that the strategy focuses on. And then lastly, issues around cybersecurity and personal data protection, which are also very key insofar as being able to access services online. So when we now start looking at the progress that has been made insofar as the strategy is concerned, this goes back to my earlier point that there's a number of different actors, a number of different contributors to this progress. So when we talk about, for instance, the cable that has just landed in Togo, for instance, which is being supported by Google and the government of Togo, that is contributing to the strategy. And you have a whole lot of initiatives across the continent that are working in different ways to contribute towards the fulfillment of the digital transformation strategy. At the level of the African Union, they have put in place a number of policy frameworks. Some of these are still under discussion and still to be validated by the various stakeholders. These include the policy frameworks on a continental framework for digital ID, issues around child online protection, the strategies for agriculture, for education, for health, with a digital underpinning, looking at emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, and of course the aspects of e-commerce as required for digital trade in line with the AFCFTA. So these are all things that are in preparation. Some of these have been presented in different forums for validation, and we expect that towards the end of this year, perhaps we will see some of these being actually validated and published, and from that perspective, entities such as ourselves, SADC, will then start to implement these different frameworks. At the same time, I think important to mention the issue of cybersecurity, because this is something that we've been working on for quite some time. The African Union has a convention on cybersecurity and personal data protection that was developed in 2014, I believe, and that requires at least 15 ratifications for it to enter into force. At the moment, I think we're just over the halfway mark in terms of those ratifications. And there is a concerted push to get those ratifications done, because we acknowledge the fact that cybersecurity and personal data protection will be very key when we start talking about digital trade. Most recently, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was a cybersecurity summit that was actually hosted in Lome, where there was a commitment to actually move towards full ratification of the convention. So we hope that perhaps in another year or two, we will see that ratification happening as member states start taking on board the convention and its provisions as well. At AUD areas, we look at hard infrastructure issues through PIDA, which is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And we have a number of border projects that have to do with either connectivity in terms of optical fiber communications. In some instances, we're looking at data centers, regional data centers that would facilitate connectivity between countries. And I think it's also significant to acknowledge that PIDA covers 4 sectors. So it's ICT, water, transport, and energy. And what we are pushing for is that we are pushing to have digitalization and the incorporation of digital aspects across all the sectors. So even though we're dealing with hard ICT infrastructure, we're also pushing to see how do we make sure that digitalization becomes embedded in the way that we build our transport networks, in the way that we do our water networks, and then of course in terms of the energy sector as well. When it comes to the energy sector, it is more not only about how do we incorporate digitalization in the sector itself, but also acknowledging the fact that without reliable energy, we will not be able to provide all these digital services. So we have to make sure that we build very robust digital networks and services across the continent that would actually drive digitalization. In that regard, we have what we call the Continental Transmission Masterplan, which is an ongoing effort to seamlessly connect all the power pools across the continent so that we can actually have trade in energy and make sure that we're able to meet the needs of every corner of the continent in terms of being able to have affordable, reliable access to energy, which in turn will also help to drive digitalization. And then lastly, I think just to also speak to the fact that we have ongoing initiatives that are supporting MSMEs. We have an initiative called the 100,000 MSMEs that is looking at how to better serve the MSME community. And in line with that, we offer online training, and we also offer very specific support to MSMEs that are involved in the digital sector. So turning now to the opportunities for private sector, I think one has to look beyond perhaps the ICT sector itself and really look at the other sectors. So when we're talking about transportation, there's a lot of opportunities for digital services and digital integration in transportation. The same thing for energy, the same thing for the water sector. So I would perhaps challenge the private sector to think beyond the pure ICT sector and really understand the African Union flagship projects. We have the high-speed rail project. We have projects that are looking at the single African air transport market. We have projects that are looking at port efficiency. projects that are looking at border posts and the efficiencies of border posts and how digitalization contributes to that. So I think the challenge is for private sector to look at these kinds of large-scale infrastructure projects and identify the digitalization opportunities that exist, and then work hand in hand with government in terms of being able to structure private-public partnerships that are able to build out that infrastructure. Let me stop there for now, unless there's specific questions, Sasha.
Thanks very much, Dr. Tawela. And I think I really like the point around focusing broader than your core digital ICT sector, because my main question I was going to pose to you, maybe we can pick it up after Dr. Lucian's presentation, is just in the context of the energy transition, how do we support digital transformation? And I think that's a critical question a lot of us are trying to grapple with as we try to kind of create a stable energy infrastructure on which to build a digital transformation for the region. So perhaps maybe I'll give you a chance to ponder on that and introduce Dr. Lucian Abrahams from Wits University, who will be discussing some of the innovation opportunities in the region. And then we can get into a little bit of a few Q&A for the two speakers. Thank you, Dr. Lucian.
Greetings everyone, and very good morning. I'm going to talk about investing in the African digital economy from the perspective of communications, but also from the perspective of financial services as an infrastructure, because communications is not the only infrastructure. Financial services is very much an infrastructure for the digital economy. Just a few quick discussion points. Smart cities, industries, schools, and other smart services will be built on not only communications, but also financial services. And when we say fintech, we don't just mean crypto. Many people interpret fintech as crypto, but we know it isn't. Even ATMs are crypto. And today, really, everyone lives by apps. People have spoken about precision agriculture, but we can also talk about digitally enabled mining operations. Both of these are really vital to the African continent, to producers on the African continent, because agriculture is being significantly affected by climate change. And we see, very dangerous and dirty work being done in mining, for example, with, virtually slave conditions for mining of 3TG and C minerals in a few African countries. Whereas there is the potential to shift to robotics applications and then use the proceeds to invest in those communities. So just to say that while infrastructures are very important, ethical conduct in the digital economy is also very important. We see the need for digital infrastructure, and by now you're aware that I'm talking about both communications and financial services infrastructure for coastal economies. So for example, along the west coast of the Western Cape, we have the Saldanha Bay Industrial Development Zone, the Marine Oil and Gas Economic Development Initiative. And they have a project called Open Saldanha, which is all about building the coastal economy in a very depressed, economically depressed part of South Africa, by also building capacities in schools. And one of the courses we've been working on is applications of dynamic software for secondary mathematics education. But then inland economies also need communications and financial services, precisely because they're generally far from international transport systems and therefore from global markets. And we see, of course, that African mobile commerce is just expanding when it comes to financial services, with mobile money, mobile credit, mobile insurance, mobile payments. And what all of this means is that it lays the foundation for cross-African trade. The speakers before me have referred to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. But e-commerce on the African continent is already quite significant and will become more significant as the South African Revenue Services and SADC customs modernization really gets going. And of course, customs modernization across the continent using digital platforms like the digital single window for trade. And we can see that banks are very much involved in that. Because of course, we have to ensure that all the checking and the regulatory compliance that is required for this kind of cross-border trade with advances in international payment gateways on the African continent, we have to see all of that evolve. So it is the infrastructure side, it's also the ethics side, it's also the regulatory side of all our business environment.
Dr. Lucian, if you don't mind, just either switching off your video, it's flashing. I think you've got your green screen on.
I will do that.
Thank you.
That's better.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
All right. So then we'll look at just a few sectors that tend to be or have been a little bit slower than most to enter this digital economy environment. But we see that these sectors where there is greater potential rather than greater activity means that there's a lot of untapped opportunity, opportunity for greater return on investment from communications infrastructure and financial services, and therefore greater need for investment in communications infrastructure and financial services. So we can see governments, we talk about the digital partner state, governments providing education platforms. So in other words, moving up, scaling up from just looking at applications to platforms, education platforms, cybersecurity, culture platforms, trade and taxation, which we've just been talking about. And I thought I'd look at a sector very, very quickly that one might consider one of the last frontiers of digital transformation, one of the last sectors to change. And that is the postal sector. And yet when we look across the SADC region, we see so much change activity in the postal sector. This, for example, is an e-commerce platform linked to the postal operator in Angola. This is a virtual post box offered by Botswana Post, and we can see many other online applications. This is the Huduma e-government e-commerce service centers, where the post office, the old post office, has been transformed to e-government and e-commerce service centers. This is the Malawi Post Corporation, where they've looked at their assets, they've said, what do we have? And they translated those assets into something that seems unlikely to do with post, and yet they have a post express, a post coach, and a post bus. So getting into the transport side of communication. This is Namibia, Nam Post, paying by swiping.
It's 11 hours.
This is Tanzania, Posta Tanzania, also big on e-commerce, called Posta Shop TZ. And this is Zimpost, Zimbabwe Post Office, translating into the digital era. So these are just examples where a sector which one might think has been in long-term decline is beginning to invent itself based on digital. And the idea is not really far-fetched. Singapore Post, for example, reinvented itself as a regional e-commerce and logistics hub for the Asia-Pacific region. But there are a few other things as well, a few other sectors, upcoming sectors, new sectors just breaking through into the economy. Walk-in service kiosks, 3D printing labs, liquid printing labs at so-called tech hubs. And these There are over 600 on the African continent, populated by young people doing all kinds of applications and leading to startups. We see at the last count, 643 tech hubs, laboratories, startup facilities, maker spaces in various places on the African continent. I've included in the photographs the Khayelitsha Bandwidth Barn, Workshop 17 at the waterfront in Cape Town. South Africa alone has over 60 such tech hubs. And these are the spaces where the digital economy of Africa's future is being created just as much as in the large-scale firms and innovative firms. So we have this innovative capacity. And what that means is that expansion of communications infrastructure, expansion of digitally enabled financial services, including fintech, this is really creates a very powerful foundation and rationale for continued investment. I will pause there for comments.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That was a very interesting presentation. I particularly liked how you've brought these examples of postal services that have re-looked at their business model completely and really try to leverage the infrastructure that they have and the custom and looking at how do they better meet the needs of their citizens and their customer base. So perhaps I'll just check for more questions on the chat, but maybe I would like to just pose a question around, similar to Dr. Tawela, around these transitions, right, that we want to see. Perhaps what are some of the key aspects that you've identified that are critical to enable this change that we want to see, and the adoption and the scale of the adoption we want to see? So perhaps as you just reflect on that question, let me bring in Dr. Tawela quickly on the previous question, and we can perhaps just take this opportunity to bring the two discussions together. Dr. Tawela?
Thank you, Harsha. So maybe you can just rephrase the question.
So Dr. Tawela, just from your perspective, understanding what are some of the critical aspects around the energy transition that need to be accelerated in order to support digital transformation in the region?
Okay, so I think a number of things there. Clearly, obviously, there's a whole push in terms of making sure that as we move towards the energy transition, that it's a green transition. So we're looking at really how are we going to build infrastructure that is green. At the same time, I think it's also about the resilience of infrastructure, and this resilience, is on a number of fronts. For instance, we're talking about the physical resilience of the infrastructure in terms of the ever-changing impacts of climate change. A few months ago, I think, when we had all these different storms and cyclones that hit Africa, and especially the south and southeastern part of Africa, we saw the devastation that caused in terms of, for instance, in my country, I'm from Malawi, and the power station was completely disabled because of the water. And so for a number of days, there was absolutely no power in the country because the infrastructure could not withstand the impacts. So things around cyber, the resilience of the infrastructure. Beyond that, I think it's also about the cyber resilience as well, because a lot of our infrastructure, be it energy, is very dependent on a very robust connectivity and availability of ICT services. So we also have to look at the issues around the resilience of the underlying ICT infrastructure, as well as the ability to respond very quickly when we have things like fiber breaks, or when we have cyber attacks and things of that sort. So when we look at the energy master plan that I was talking about, we are very careful to understand the fact that a lot of that has to also be based on renewables. We know that Africa's potential in terms of renewables is huge and it's vast and it's still largely untapped. And the question is, how are we going to do that? And how are we going to do it in a way that is cost effective and in a way that is efficient? So the master plan looks at issues around hydro, obviously as a big source of renewable, but we're also looking at issues around wind energy, looking at solar energy at scale, and then also looking at the newer technologies that are being discussed in terms of the hydrogen and other opportunities as well. So all these things are being talked about, but the issue for us is always going to be number one, that it's a just transition, and number two, that it is done in a way that is efficient and cost effective for the continent.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Tuwela. And I think we all are eager to make this work in a sustainable manner, especially understanding the implications. Dr. Lucian, with a quick response, if you don't mind, to the question around, what are the key factors that are in enabling the transition from your perspective?
So I wanted to talk about public access or rather, let me say, access in public spaces and access in private spaces. Because I think if we had a strategy, a business/government/everybody strategy to have Wi-Fi in public spaces, I'm not saying it should be free, but Wi-Fi in public spaces, or low-cost Wi-Fi in public spaces and low-cost Wi-Fi in private spaces. So if you think about it, when we go to a hotel, right, and we're a hotel guest in some way or another, first thing we ask for is the Wi-Fi password. We go to a cafe for coffee, and the first thing we ask for is the Wi-Fi password. In fact, anywhere we go that's a public/private space, the first thing we ask for is the Wi-Fi password. In fact, we ask for the Wi-Fi password before we order our coffee. So just imagine if we had across the African continent, free or low cost, literally for the price of a coffee, Wi-Fi in public spaces and in private spaces. Since we're in a banking forum, I know it's not a banking forum, but it's Nedbank hosted. It just made me think of banks. If I go to Standard Bank or Capitec or Nedbank or any bank, like when I walk in, can I get Wi-Fi for the short period that I'm there? I know we don't want, people sitting in the bank for 5 hours just to use the Wi-Fi. But I think the idea of free/low cost Wi-Fi in public spaces and private spaces can do a lot to broaden the current levels of enablement. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lucian. Slightly different tangent, but I think the inputs are definitely welcome. Let me take this opportunity to quickly welcome Dr. George from the SADC Secretariat to share with us the region's infrastructure strategy. Thank you, Dr. Theo.
Good morning, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I wish to thank the NEPAD Business Foundation for inviting SADC Secretariat to our first participation in the networking forum. I have several slides. Okay, so I will introduce the SADC ICT infrastructure strategy, what we call the Digital SADC 2027. We shall look at the SADC ICT landscape and review it. I will speak about the stakeholder engagement, which is a key aspect of this forum, and wrap up with some conclusions. The infrastructure development is in support of regional integration, is the second pillar of the SADC Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, what we call RISDIP 2020-2030. Basically, that's the 10-year strategic development plan, which sets the goals, targets, implementation, and M&E. Infrastructure is one of the 3 pillars of implementation of the SADC industrialization strategy and roadmap. The RISDP, Pillar 2, has 3 infrastructure strategic objectives. And one of the key result areas under infrastructure for implementing the 3 RISDP strategic objectives is to establish universal access to affordable ICTs. So the Regional Infrastructure Development Master Plan, RIDIM, is the blueprint for infrastructure development to facilitate regional integration as guided by the RISDIP, as well as the SADC's Vision 2050. The RIDMP consists of 6 chapters: ICT, transport, energy, water, meteorology, and tourism. That was approved by SADC Summit of August 2012. It is a 15-year-old plan, and the Digital SADC 2027 is one of the chapters. It is the ICT chapter of the RIDMP. It consists of 18 projects, and the Digital SADC 2027 consists of 4 pillars, as you can see in the figure, with 2 platforms. It constitutes of hard ICT infrastructure projects, as well as soft ICT projects relating to policy, regulatory, and institutional capacity building. The baseline of the ICT sector back then in 2012 were as follows. Average mobile penetration was at 60%, fixed line penetration was at 6%, internet user penetration was at 4%. The targets that we agreed to reach by 2027 was 20% internet user penetration and 80 to 90% of households and businesses with internet access. The 3 key SADC regional ICT implementing agencies that support SADC to execute its mandate are CRASA, that groups all the national regulatory authorities, SATA, that groups all the ICT operators, and lastly, SAPOA, that groups all the designated postal operators. In implementing the Digital SADC 2027, the following have been achieved. The region has prepared over 70 SADC policy regulatory framework instruments and pursued a wide range of capacity building initiatives. All SADC member states have established at least 1 cross-border link to its neighbor and at least 2 cross-border terrestrial optical fiber cable links for regional and international transit traffic. This was under the SADC Regional Information Infrastructure project implemented by SATA. All our island states have at least 2 submarine cable connections for the international connectivity. SADC average population coverage by mobile networks was at 88%. These figures are from year 2020, so they might be higher now, or definitely they'll be higher now. The mobile penetration for SADC is at 77.4%. So that's roughly 3 out of 4 people using mobile services. The SADC average internet user penetration increased from 4%, as I mentioned earlier, in 2012. And in 2020, it was at 22.9%, compared to the world average at 51% and developed countries at 87%. Growth rate per year for SADC for internet user penetration is at 2.4%. Household internet access was at 27.8%, and that was less than half the world average, which sat at 72%. I continue with the landscape. The SADC region is in the early stages of 5G trials and deployments in Botswana, Lesotho, island of Mauritius, Mozambique, Seychelles, and South Africa. And licenses have been issued to several other mobile network operators. We have almost twice more men with internet access than women. Our internet gender parity scores at 0.54 compared to the world at 0.87. So you can see digital gender gap appears to be a concern. In the SADC region, we have around 122 operational data centers, of which 13 are carrier neutral of Tier 3 or 4 certification. 5 member states have advanced internet exchange points, bringing a total of 26 internet exchange points in the region, and that's about 57% share of IXPs in Africa. 8 member states have completed the digital terrestrial television migration, and the remaining member states are at advanced stage in dual illumination, in other words, running the analog and DDT networks at the same time. All member states except Madagascar are streaming the national public TV channel online. 11 member states are pilot broadcasting the SADC TV channel, which is a combine of content of TV programs from the region. And this project will be officially launched sometime this year. As to what I mentioned about cybersecurity, in 2012, the SADC Harmonized Cybersecurity Legal Framework consists of 3 model laws were developed. All SADC member states have either transposed the SADC e-commerce or e-transaction and the cybercrime model laws, or have an existing legal framework in place. 8 member states have put into place laws on data protection. 6 member states have established or operationalized their national CERT, and the remaining member states, in other words, the remaining 10 member states, have committed to have theirs operational by the end of this year. So if we look at a review of what I've presented, while 88% of SADC's population have mobile internet coverage, only 1 in every 4 people is using internet, resulting in a large uptake gap, which is the highest in rural areas and among women. Although SADC has relatively a high mobile penetration, a large segment of the SADC population is still yet to be connected to the internet. In 2018, SADC ICT ministers established 10 broadband targets. I just want to take 2 to be achieved by 2025. Broadband user penetration in each SADC member state should reach 65%, and 50% of households in each SADC member state should be connected to broadband. So you can see, if we are to achieve these targets, SADC internet base, user base, is bound to at least double or triple by 2025. Africa's population is at 1 billion and SADC is 1/3 of that. We need to connect at least 140 million people in the next 4 years. So if you look at these numbers, minimum, we need a growth of 10% internet user penetration per year. Small SADC member states, such as Mauritius, with a population of 1.3 million, has 3 submarine cables: Safe, Lion, and Métis. Lion and Métis are submarine cables built by Mauritius, while Seychelles, with a population of 100,000 people, has 2 submarine cables, Seas and Peace. Peace was commissioned last month. They're planning to go on to Africa, which is the 3rd network. On the coastal and landlocked countries, they are pursuing multiple first-line links. You heard Pasha mention about Equiano. Namibia has already built the landing station. Botswana is also looking into many cross-border links. Peak internet traffic profiles experienced by internet service providers during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 are now the norm, putting more pressure on ICT infrastructure that is currently available. This calls for revamped ICT infrastructure strategies. In other words, high-impact ICT projects. We need to build a lot more data centers, preferably carrier-neutral data centers, which will result in really good tariffs. We need to expedite 5G rollout. We need to stimulate aggressive competition on transit links and middle mile, and explore cost-effective last mile solutions to bring about lower tariffs for ICT services. We need to explore assembly and manufacturing plants for ICT devices and equipment. Our continent is blessed with copper, but we didn't connect every home with copper. We missed that bandwagon. We are blessed with silica. Let's not miss this one. We need to start building OFCs and equipment and devices for the continent. Let's connect all our homes. We need to own and operate a regional GSO communication satellite to ensure access to ICT services in the underserved and rural areas. Lastly, we need to enhance broadband connectivity coverage along the infrastructure corridors for transport, water, and energy. The key focus of today's forum, I see, has to do with stakeholder engagement. Compared to other ICT, to other infrastructure sectors, ICT is primarily driven by private sector. The membership of SATA are private license operators. In the events organized by SADC Secretariat and its implementing agencies, CRASA, SATA, and SAPOA, involve private sector. Our modes of operandi are workshops, preparatory meetings, investment conferences, ministerial roundtables, etc. We have noted higher private sector participation and engagement through virtual participation. Most ICT projects are implemented at the national level, hence, private sector participation is mostly at that level. The SADC Secretariat is developing a web platform for infrastructure projects for ICT, energy, transport, water, and meteorology sectors, and that will be accessible by the public. A study has commenced recently on stakeholder mapping under the EGEE ICT program. So let me introduce you to the EGEE ICT program. Enhancing governance and enabling environment in the ICT sector, in short, EGEE ICT, is a 4-year tripartite program supported by the EU. It began January last year, 2021, and COMESA is the lead rec. The overall objective is to support growth in ICT sector and deepen regional integration in the Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, and Indian Ocean region. The 3 specific objectives include: 1, strengthening the regional policy and institutional framework for ICT development; 2, enhance the policy and regulatory environment for competitive and gender-sensitive ICT markets; and 3, improve infrastructure, connectivity, and access to ICT services. Now, on the first SO, one of the outputs is develop a mechanism for consensus building in policy development among public and private sectors. The deliverable is a report on stakeholder mapping study, which I earlier mentioned, and a strategic framework for stakeholder cooperation. On the last SO, one of the outputs is policies to promote private sector investment in ICT infrastructure. The deliverable is a policy and regulation to enhance private sector investment. So this private sector investment on policy formulation and ICT infrastructure investment has been a long time coming. And this is what's going to really help us to expedite the implementation of digital transformation in SADC. Let me take a minute to introduce you to some of the key strategic interventions stipulated in the Digital SADC 2027 and the RISDIP 2022-2023, in other words, this year's plan. We start our plan in April and we end in March the following year. Most important, to continue facilitating dialogue and development of the SADC Harmonized Common Positions proposal for WRC 23. The outcomes of the World Radio Communications Conference is what feeds into updating the SADC radio frequency spectrum allocation plan. And that's the mechanism that unlocks adequate spectrum for harmonized and coordinated deployment of wireless technology in the region. We wish to continue implementing the SADC roadmap for advanced internet exchange transformation. We will review, actually we've already started reviewing the SADC harmonized cybersecurity model laws. We will continue to operationalize the frameworks for the establishment of the SADC regional CERT, as well as the SADC shared satellite system. We will continue to establish the SADC ICT Observatory and the SADC Regional ICT COE. Earlier, the Madame from Cisco mentioned indices. The SADC ICT Observatory will develop digital indices for us to measure our progress as we implement the digital transformation. We will continue implementing phase 3 of SADC roaming project, which has to do with cost-based pricing. We are using a SADC roaming cost model that has been developed, and we plan to develop the SADC postal strategy, which will have a strong component, as Dr. Lucy mentioned, on e-commerce. We've already started. We also will develop the SADC model National Emergency Telecommunications Plan, and the biggest one of all is develop the SADC digital transformation and its implementation plan. I wish to conclude that the Digital SADC 2027 will be updated this year. It is the STAP 2, the Short Action Plan 2 from 2022 to 2027. A study on the development of SADC's digital transformation strategy and implementation plan has commenced. We are supported by EU with that. This will guide the transformative process on for the region into a inclusive digital economy. The EGEE ICT program, which I earlier described, will contribute towards the SADC digital infrastructure and also provide strategic framework policies, and regulations for consensus building in policy development among public and private sectors, and promote private sector investment and in ICT. Now, this will be completed in 2022. And one of the challenges of the region is transposition or domestication of model policies and regulations. There is support in the program to capacitate and assist member states to quickly domesticate whatever policies and regulations that come out of this project. As I mentioned earlier, a SADC web platform to list all SADC infrastructure projects is being developed. This will be concluded by mid this year. So as we are developing projects, or as projects are already been ready to be financed, these projects will be listed and you'll have access to them. The SADC Secretariat is exploring wider platforms for stakeholder dialogue and engagement, but we will provide more information when you give us a chance to participate in such forums. Last but not the least, this is the time for investment in SADC ICT sector, as it will be a catalyst for post-COVID-19 recovery of SADC's economy. Development partners from the private sector encouraged to come on board. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. Really appreciate that insightful presentation on all the work that's being done by the SADC Secretariat. I'm sure there'll be a few questions we can touch on in the discussion shortly. Let me take this opportunity to quickly introduce Dr. Isabel Neto from the World Bank, who will give us a brief update on some of the projects that are in progress at the moment in the region. Isabel? Thank you.
Hi everybody. Good morning. I'm joining you from the Nairobi office. Nice to see everybody, and thank you for the good presentation so far. Let me share my screen, and then we'll go over to start the presentation. Can you see my screen? You can. Okay, very good. Okay, so first of all, once again, thank you for having me. I think some of the themes that the previous speakers have been talking about will come up again in my presentation. Of course, different perspectives, but that's good news, because it means that we're all thinking along, similar lines in similar relevant aspects. So maybe first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Isabel. I'm the practice manager for digital developments covering Eastern and Southern Africa. So basically covering the 26 countries, kind of south of the line that goes across kind of Sudan, South Sudan, and then cuts across kind of Uganda, Rwanda, DRC, and everything that is south of that. But working very closely, of course, with also my colleague on the other side. But for the purposes of today's meeting, that really means that I cover the countries that we are mostly looking at today. So with that, maybe let me say a few words just about the World Bank. So as you may know, the World Bank, what people typically call the World Bank, is actually a set of different institutions. We have IBRD and IDA, which are what is normally called the World Bank, and this is a part of the bank that actually works with governments. But then we also have IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the part of the World Bank that deals with the private sector, so that provides financing and advisory services to the private sector, and also MIGA, who provides guarantees, notably political risk guarantees for the private sector. And then finally, another institution, which is the one that people know least, which is the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. But really, typically when people talk about the World Bank, it's IBRD and IDA, so it's the parts of the World Bank that works with government, and IFC, working with the private sector. You have some figures here for the type of assistance that we provide to governments around the world. Then I wanted to talk to you about the World Bank Digital Economy for Africa initiative. So, I mean, I'm aware that I'm talking to people from the sector, so you may be already aware of this, but basically the World Bank together with the African Union or the World Bank has supported the African Union in launching this digital transformation for Africa initiative. At some stage, it was also referred to as the Moonshot, the Moonshot Initiative. And really, the purpose of that initiative is to make sure that every government, citizen, and business are digitally enabled by 2030. So this work actually goes hand in hand with the work that was developed at the level of the UN Broadband Commission to look again at what kind of investments and strategies could be adopted to reach universal access by 2030. There's maybe if I can ask people to mute because I can hear somebody's cough. Okay, and so this Digital Economy for Africa initiative recognizes that digital is much more than just infrastructure. Yes, one of the pillars of if we conceptualize what the digital economy is about, one of the pillars is digital infrastructure. But then we also look at digital platforms, digital financial services, digital skills, and digital entrepreneurship. And it's really the ecosystem of all these things together that will enable governments to really take advantage of this opportunity. So how does this Digital Economy for Africa initiative materialize? So first of all, we've been actually assisting various governments develop diagnostics to, according to the framework that I've just changed, those 5 pillars, really do country diagnostics to take stock of where we are in each country and what would be the main recommendations to move the sector to the next stage. So you will see in this map that we've actually completed diagnostics for most of countries in the region. With regards to Southern Africa, we're currently developing a diagnostic for Namibia. And then most other documents have been delivered to government, and most of them are actually available on our website. So you can consult them online. What this has allowed us is also to enter into a conversation with government and the private sector to see what on that basis would be the priority projects and what can we develop together. So as part of that, we are now in kind of project preparation mode or project implementation mode, as the case may be in several countries. For example, in the region, we are currently in we have, for example, an active project in Malawi. We are at advanced stages. And so we have an active project in Malawi and discussing a follow-up phase. There's also a couple of projects active in Mozambique and another one being developed. Same thing for Madagascar, Comoros, and considering also other projects in several other countries in the region. And I can go more into detail if that's of interest. But really, I think that's beyond the national operations that we are developing with governments in the private sector, country by country, we really see a need and an interest, a need and an interest to look at regional approaches for accelerating digital developments. Our work on the digital, on the UN Broadband Commission has shown that investments of close to 100 billion will be needed to actually be able to implement that vision for the continent. And we see that there's several levers that need to be activated for both, so that there's a clear vision of what we want to see accomplished, but also that we can bring in the private sector to invest, complemented by public sector investment where needed. And then we see also as quite key looking at regional integration efforts. In particular, there's of course the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that is going towards implementation, and we actually think that there's quite a relevant discussion around both looking at digital tools for implementation of that agreement, but also what is also the digital markets that can be realized in that context. And as we think through that, and as we think through how to actually create a single digital market, we really see as really key enhancing this sub-regional and continental level coordination with the RECs. So basically, yes, country by country, there's actions to be taken, but if we want to create those synergies and cross-border coordination across countries, we really need to see at regional level what can be done to accelerate it. So in this slide, you actually see an example of a project that we have not in SADC, but not in Southern Africa, but in the Eastern Africa region. And I'm just showing it here as an example. But in Eastern Africa, we are working on an investment project that would cover the Horn of Africa, and then coordination between EAC countries to create precisely that single digital market. So the estimated value for this program is 230 million. So in the countries that you see in yellow, in the Horn of Africa, we would mostly be looking at financing of infrastructure in various layers, and I'll coming back to that in a minute. But then also for the countries in the Eastern Africa community, there we already have national projects, and we would be working with the EAC, to look at how to enhance coordination across borders. So you see here what is being proposed in terms of the countries that would be included, both in the investment side, but then also RECs. And really the idea here is that, yes, to come in with public funding, but to complement private investments as well. So what is the single digital market? The way we see it, it can mean different things to different people. But so the World Bank has conducted this analytical work to look at this SDM framework. And we actually see three layers. There's the connectivity layer, the data layer, and then the online market layer. And you see in this picture what may be involved in each one of these layers in terms of, connectivity market. We're looking much more at the kind of the cross-border links, but also the cross-border barriers in terms of regulation. When we look at single markets, we're looking at everything that has to do with data protection, cybersecurity, content regulation, and then finally the online market, which then has to do much more about the transactions that can happen online, digital payments, having interoperability for digital ID, and so on, so that really countries can talk to each other also online. So, I mean, I've just shown you what we're thinking for Eastern Africa, but together, of course, with relevant institutions. But we really think that there's a real opportunity for also looking at the Southern Africa single digital market. And we've in its regional dialogue, we're actually in touch with SADC and actually also COMESA. I think both SADC and COMESA have indicated digital as an area where they would really welcome additional collaboration with the World Bank. And so specifically, given what I've just described, we are currently looking at how to extend the kind of the type of programs we are developing in Eastern Africa, how to bring them also to the Southern Africa region. And just last week, for example, I was in Malawi, who is currently coordinating, who's currently the chair for SADC, and discussing with the minister there how also his own particular interest on that. But going forwards, I think this dialogue with SADC and the countries will really intensify, so that we can see how to take it forward in practice. So that's it from my side. I hope I didn't go over time, not too much, and very keen to hear your questions and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Slightly over time, but I think we were all very interested, so we didn't want to cut you short too much. I think I think the point you're raising around driving a regional approach towards development is quite encouraging, because I think it'll resonate, especially as we try to reap the rewards of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. It's really trying to make this transition work for all stakeholders. There was just one question whether you'd be happy to share your slides, and I doubt that there's any concern with that regard. So please kindly, I think that would just be a request from the group. There was definitely interest. So perhaps as we get into the discussion, we can explore a few more questions. So perhaps allow me to shift gears slightly, if our panelists can switch on their video as we move to the facilitated discussion around business perspectives on the implementation challenges and opportunities to support development and the financing of digital infrastructure. We are joined by Sabine who's the Chief Executive Officer for Siemens. Thank you so much for joining us. Mike Pio, who's the Head of Infrastructure, Energy and Telecoms at Nedbank, and then Janita Clark, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Digital Council Africa, who represents quite a few of the digital and telecoms stakeholders in the region as well. So thank you very much to our panel. And I think we've had a fair share of inputs this morning, really kind of giving us a good sense of all the work that's being done. And I think perhaps if we can maybe just start from a technical perspective, Sabine, with yourself, in terms of, are you Siemens targeting any specific digital infrastructure opportunities? And if so, what are some of the things that make them attractive or actually not attractive for Siemens? Just to start giving us a bit more, get the discussion going this morning. Thank you, Sabine.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Really interesting session so far, and I hope I'm not repeating some of the stuff which previous presenters already have highlighted, because as you look at digital infrastructure and digital application, particular within Africa, I think one we need to say first is that COVID-19 has, expedited the adaptation on the African continent like we would not have imagined before. If I overthink, we believe before COVID-19, more than 700 days ago, you would have thought that, with Africa, it maybe take another 5 years. And right in the first year in 2020, we did see that, vital infrastructure, like, for instance, energy, could be transformed through digital applications, but also infrastructure objectives like, for instance, the oil and gas industry, many of the manufacturing activities in the mining environment. We use digital technology in order to connect to sites while travel was not possible. And so here there are a few areas which we find are extremely interesting. And what has been highlighted within during COVID-19 is clearly also the access to water, access to clean water. And here we have seen as well digital technologies coming in. But we also have heard that, there is a huge limitation on the continent, because also the continent has adapted very fast, but we have a huge skill gap, and some of the previous presenters already alluded to it, really getting the skill base up, getting people savvy for digital applications. And I'm not talking only about mobile banking, but I mean, when we talk about Siemens, we talk about the industrial application of the Internet of Things, meaning the industrial Internet of Things, because that will assist the African continent, and from our point of view is the only opportunity for Africa to really participate in a global supply chain and remain globally competitive or become globally competitive, depending in which countries we are active. So when we look at the industries which we find particular of interest, then it's clearly energy and water. Why energy and water? Because here you need to measure consumption, you need to make sure that you have revenue collection. And we have seen in two countries, and earlier it was mentioned Botswana, which is actually ahead of South Africa in the digital readiness report. Botswana, for instance, have set out a portion of their water networks already into a digital space, which clearly makes them the leading country and the leading utility on the African continent going in that direction. And here it's really around, keeping data in consumption and supply digitally available. And that is very important, not only for water, but also for electricity, because we want to know if we go into a more renewable transition, which obviously with the global aspect of climate change, and you will have heard the report, which was published 2 days ago from the International Climate Commission, that we really have to all pull together into the same direction and manage the resources more effectively. And as we have, fluctuations within, sun being available, wind being available at certain times and at certain intensities during the day and during the night, that needs to be managed digitally. And that is not humanly possible effectively in any other way or form. So these are clearly very interesting aspects for us to work for. Which ones are successful? It's really depending on it, maybe leads a little bit also to the presentation by the World Bank. It is really depending on what kind of readiness the countries have and what kind of aspiration these countries have. And I must say, obviously, South Africa just recently had the auction of the spectrum or the 5G network, but Ghana, Rwanda, we see, as said, Botswana, which are really going into the direction and try to transform the industries. When I think about the activities, particular in the 5G network, we see that we cannot have just private public spaces in the network. We do need to have as well an industrial network being available, but maybe I explain that in a minute.
Thanks so much, Sabine. And I love the point you're bringing around the transition for digital transformation needs to be done in tandem with our climate change response. And I think that's bringing that to the fore really helps. And I know, Mike, in your space, looking after both energy, infrastructure, and energy. I'm keen to get your thoughts around what are Nedbank's interests specifically around digital infrastructure, and how are you balancing these two out that Sabine has just highlighted?
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. So firstly, I think just to kick off, digital infrastructure is a term that has been coined recently, but we've been investing in digital infrastructure for 20 plus years now. We invested in the first mobile network licenses in South Africa 20 years ago, believe it or not. Since then, Nedbank played quite a leading role in a number of landmark transactions, including things like the Seacom undersea cable, which brought the internet to the entire east coast of Africa. We financed a satellite, the first satellite for Africa, as well as playing in the tower infrastructure space, financing the tower cos, financing data centers, terrestrial fiber, and it's been an integrated part of our lending business for the better part of 20 years. So right now, I'd just like to make sort of two observations, and Sabine did steal quite a lot of my thunder in that almost everything we can do from here on out has to involve all three of those particular aspects. The digital infrastructure connected to physical infrastructure connected to energy supply is now 100% integrated, and therefore we almost can't invest in one piece without understanding the consequence on all of the other pieces. So just two observations that weren't specifically picked on, but that I think are very important. A recent study says that we're going to double our population, Africa will double its population by 2050. And in doing so, by 2025, we need to create 15 million new jobs. Most of those jobs are going to need to be created in the sort of the tech type sectors. We're going to need to, the countries will have to invest in technology and digital infrastructure to create those jobs fundamentally. And the key driver of that investment will be having the right digital infrastructure layers to enable it. The second part, Sabine did really touch on massively, is that digital infrastructure it's enabling technology for all the interconnectivity and instrumented kind of world that we're looking to play in right now, which will enable the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things are going to create most of the interactions which will unleash the fourth industrial revolution. So as part of that, very simple examples in our space are things like smart metering. For the last 10 years, many countries on the continent have spent money on smart meters, but really have not been smart meters. They've just been meters that have taken place. The advent of what we can do with a combination of that data that now can sit behind smart meters and our ability to interrogate that means we can fix the 50 broken utilities on the continent. I mean, the recent World Bank report suggested that there are only 2 countries or 3 countries on the continent that have utilities that are able to regularly borrow money on their own balance sheets. The enablement of smart meters coupled with big data analysis, coupled with the ability to ensure that data, and by ensuring that, I mean ensuring things like credit collections, once you have big data, means you can almost transform all of those utilities by being able to fix technical losses on one side, and it doesn't matter whether it's water or power, you can fix technical losses on one side and you can fix revenue collections on the other side. So without energy, we don't get to creating those 15 million tech jobs because we don't have the industry that can do it. So again, I'm hoping that describes the, really the interconnectivity from a banker's perspective. We have to build digital infrastructure and keep financing it. But that said and done, it's a very easy piece of infrastructure to finance because again, as I mentioned, we have been financing that infrastructure for 15 to 20 years. We have some major IPOs of some of the biggest telco towers in Africa happening right now. Many of the countries that are providing the most amazing broadband services to Africa, like Liquid Telecoms, are listed in international markets. They raise money on global bond markets at extremely good rates. So digital infrastructure actually is a very easy piece of infrastructure to finance, and it's in some ways it's easier than things like power stations because the debt tenors that are needed are infinitely smaller than for a major new power station, a major new road system or rail network that might exist across the country. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Mike, for your input. I think the point you're touching on it around the investment in digital infrastructure and how it can unlock funding to address our needs for our utilities in the region is quite significant. And I think starting to think about how do we look at the interconnectivity of this and use that to establish the credibility for financing the investments, but also building the case for that transition, right? And there's quite a few points, Janita, I'm gonna maybe ask you to touch on it around the skills development aspect that's been highlighted in the chat and in the discussion, and perhaps what is the sentiment from some of the industry players in terms of where we are investing, specifically around perhaps firstly skills, and maybe if you want to comment around some of the IPOs that we're expecting for digital infrastructure coming up shortly.
Morning, colleagues, and thanks for that, Harsha. It's nice to be here. So firstly, let's just quickly talk about the skills thing. So skills is the digital economy is a very broad sector. There's one component of it, which I think Mr. Hoffman might be alluding to, which is the actual, deployment, the immediate job creation opportunities that comes along with putting infrastructure in the ground, the outbuilding of towers, sort of the hardware that's associated with deploying digital infrastructure. But there's a much bigger problem that we're facing as a continent, and that is the the greater access to the digital economy from a skills point of view. If you look at developing nations like India, approximately 60% of companies that are registered in India today are tech companies. There's a great harnessing of and making use of digital infrastructure to grow. And in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, it feels like there's, we're lagging a little bit when it comes to the digital economy and how we're harnessing the opportunities within the digital economy. And we've got to probably go back to our school system. We have to create a attitude of skills development and understanding what this is potentially going to look like going forward. But I think what's really important as well is that we have to have a sort of cross-sector understanding of where future skills are going to be needed, those high-demand jobs, when it comes to things like fintech and agri, etc., to deploy those and to actually train those skills. We've just seen again that the president, that there was an announcement that we have now reached an all-time low, particularly in South Africa, when it comes to jobs. And unfortunately, the youth is always sort of in the back of that. And in order to solve those dilemmas, we need to go and look at first where we're going to lose those jobs, and then not just skills development, which is one word, but I think there's a new word that we need to start talking about, and that's reskilling. So how do we have to reskill, and in which sectors do we have to go out and actively develop those skills to harness and to capitalize on the opportunity that's going to be created. So that's the one side. The other side is that there's a tremendous need for policy harmonization across sub-Saharan Africa, which, and I think Mike will know that, this is just a drum that we have been beating for 12 years, talking about effective policy, effective regulation, removal of red tape, barriers to entry, etc. And still, we're very fortunate that we've seen in South Africa, particularly, spectrum's been allocated, so lots of excitement around that. There's ongoing conversations. We're doing a lot of research work around the 5G economy and what that potentially opportunities related to that. But there's still a lot of sort of continental policy harmonization that needs to take place that will just ensure some project sanity when it comes to project turnaround times, things like that. And I think it's really important that, we come together as a continent and we talk about exactly what it is that we want to achieve, where we need to go, have serious conversations about the digital divide, which is a massive threat to the continent in general. And, we've been talking about the COVID pandemic and how it's catapulted the continent into what we refer to as the fourth industrial revolution. The problem with that, unfortunately, is that it's further marginalized some communities. And until such time as we have those conversations around how do we ensure that everybody equally participates in the digital economy going forward, we're unfortunately still going to be a continent that's failing at this to a large extent.
Thanks, Janita. And I think bringing up the point around the digital transformation has this massive opportunity to unlock all this potential, and at the same time can actually, if not leveraged and executed properly, could actually further divide us as a community. So perhaps maybe just taking, we're going to open up the discussion, but I want to just go around the panel for one quick input each. And firstly, Sabine, just from your perspective, what is required to unlock digital infrastructure development in the region for an organization like Siemens?
Well, as I followed a little bit as well the discussion in the chat, and when it comes to skills, and we do also have acknowledged that, you know, specifically in South Africa, coding is not part of the subject in school, of the curriculum. These are things which are absolutely important, because, you know, young people need to find employment, because if we can't find the resources, you know, you are not able to expedite the rollout of anything onto the continent, yeah? Then you have only like individual pockets of countries, but it doesn't connect to a bigger picture. So finding the resources, skilling people from a young age, but also I would agree with you, Anita, with upskilling colleagues within our workforce in Siemens. That is part of our strategy, which we call also employability for our employees, to make sure that they have, independent of the age, a possibility to participate in the digital economy. And I do see that there needs to be some alignment between the regions. I think network availability is absolutely vital in order to make things happening, because as you think about the Internet of Things, and we call it then the industrial Internet of Things for the machine-to-machine communication, you know, you want to have these jobs which do the coding and the programming for these kind of applications on the continent, and that you only can have if we are able to get these skills trained and find these resources. If I look at our workforce, and this is, you know, breaking my heart, we have now 35.3% unemployment rate, and I have a whole number of jobs, specifically in the digital space, but also in digital engineering space, software space, which are not able to fill because we can't find these resources. And that shows me this is the most important part, because once you can leapfrog into the situation that you can employ people of that nature, it will spread and it will bring more people in. I don't think there is too much investment required. I mean, Mike already spoke to, you know, all the C-cable activities, the funding thereof. From what we see right now for the applications available, that would be sufficient. But one thing I think is more a policy and as well a mental issue with regards to, you know, how do utilities think about how they want to operate their business. And quite frank, the topic of sustainability, climate change is not going to happen without having digital applications. And you maybe need to think for a digital roadmap for a country. Yeah? You can't have, like, maybe taking the example of South Africa, ESCOM working in one space and water people working in one space. It needs to be really an integrated strategy where also everybody can participate to make sure that individual countries are not, you know, one vendor dependent, which we also want to avoid. So there I see it needs to be a mind shift, and, you know, the NEPAD Business Foundation works exactly on these areas, because we want to make sure what is possible once you start standardizing.
Thanks so much, Sabine. I think you're bringing up the point around connectivity as a utility, which I know is something we've been speaking about for some time, and I think the touch point around the integration again. Mike, perhaps from your perspective, you know, you've said that funding digital infrastructure is something you've been doing for a long time, and, you know, it's actually more easier than doing some of our other utilities like power, other infrastructures like power. I'm quite keen to maybe get your perspective on potentially areas in which we can put perhaps conditions or outcomes similar to the way you've structured, the bank has structured impact bonds previously, to drive outcomes in investments that materialize in areas around employment or economic growth, etc. Perhaps, Mike, if you want to touch on that, I hope it's not too difficult.
So I'm going to actually take a much more contrarian view. I think we need far less regulation and far less bureaucracy. The private sector and most of what's happening in this digital infrastructure world does not need regulation, and it does not need more layers of bureaucracy. I mean, broadband needs things like spectrum, for argument's sake, but it's impossible that broadband can take 15 years to allocate, to work out a mechanism to allocate it. So what we need is the private sector to be allowed to move with these initiatives, and it will in itself create the jobs. So in the COVID world, an application like Zoom that we all now depend on almost to conduct our business in our daily lives, the Amazons of this world, the Takealots have created distribution networks and have created hundreds of thousands of jobs worldwide without any regulatory interference. So I don't think the constraint is access to funding. Impact bonds, so far, while they have a very necessary role to play, are not providing cheaper funding to anybody for any projects yet, and it will eventually arise. But right now, we have very little evidence that an impact bond provides cheaper funding, which could be used to then support industries which need cheaper funding. What we need to create enabling environments where small entrepreneurs can operate very quickly and easily. And a very good example of this is something like the tower space, community-based tower operators that can run small businesses and towers in rural areas. They need to be enabled, they need to be supported. I really don't believe that all of the policy frameworks that are being set up are actually creating any new jobs. They are supposed to create enabling environments, but what we don't see is that next level of the actual deregulation, which makes it easier for people to get licenses, to get permits. We have a number of examples in the energy sector, for example, where we have constrained growth and we have constrained development because we don't enable entrepreneurs to get on and build things that they can build and that they, sorry, with the consequential job creation that would go along with that.
Thanks so much, Mike. And I appreciate sort of the candidness around impact bonds as well, and what's working and what's not working. Maybe Janita, just from your side, if you can perhaps share a little bit around what are some of the members of the Digital Council for Africa doing in terms of driving inclusive growth and development in the telecoms sector, and where can we do more, perhaps, from your perspective?
Thanks, Asha. I really, really wish that I could right now engage in a highly scientific, complex conversation where we need to talk about, business cases, etc. But it's really simple things that government can put in place to help. We've sort of touched on a policy environment that needs to be, effectively managed, and that needs to be enabling. As Mike said, we don't want to over-regulate sectors. I often feel like, we're always sort of on the back foot. We wait for mass data and cloud adoption, and then we try and put policies in place to now govern this sort of, and we try and reverse engineer it, but we've hardly got any view of what the future looks like. I like, in Europe, there's a lot of movement more towards self-regulation, enabling, sectors to work, amongst themselves, to keep each other honest, to be audited, but to allow for a policy framework that's agile and that can be adjusted as and when, and that doesn't have to go, through rigid policy framework changes and parliamentary changes, etc. So that's some of the areas. I think that we've seen that there's massive appetite from lower income areas, and I also think that we've seen some of the pricing, through somebody like a Vuma Reach that they've done. Open Serve also launched phenomenal products in lower income areas that I think is quite commendable. And I understand that in many of these cases, the adoption and the take rate of services in lower income area actually exceeds that, of higher, more affordable income areas, as one would expect. But it's quite the contrary, because the price points are so favorable. So I think if we can, put things in place, like making permissions available for lower income areas and allowing operators to move forward much faster, to create policy environments. We've seen in Gauteng provincial government, they've just launched what they call the township bill, which is really just seeking to enable low-income economies and stimulate economic activity in those areas. And if we could sort of expand that and, not just in a province, but maybe across the continent, making it easier for people to do business in lower income areas, I think that would go a long way. And then handle the things that, my colleagues from the rest of the world, if we talk about things like the construction mafia, etc. I mean, they're shocked. They don't understand that, but it's a real concern here, and people literally die for deploying what on the one hand we call a human right, is access to connectivity, but on the other side, operators have to insanely so battle things like construction mafia on a daily basis to deploy broadband infrastructure. So, I mean, this is a conversation we can have for 5 days, but I think that, we'll leave it at that. But I think those are some big things, and not as complex as we'd like it to be.
Thanks, Janetta. I'm going to open up the discussion a little bit and draw on a few colleagues who posed some questions ahead of the session. And maybe as I do that, I'm maybe going to call on Alfie if you're still on the line. Sorry if I'm not able to see if everybody's on the line. Alfie from Cisco, just maybe to touch a little bit around the opening remarks Charmaine made around the Center for the Edge, and potentially what kind of growth are you seeing in the investments that you've made thus far in the development of SMMEs at these centers? Just checking if Alfie's here. Can just unmute. Okay, I'm going to move on. If I do find Alfie, we'll definitely turn back to him. Perhaps maybe let's Karabo, you're on the line from Amazon Web Services. I thought it would be good to get your perspective as a large, another large infrastructure player, given the investments that you've been making with the data centers, etc. Just to share your thoughts around, what are some of the critical enabling environments factors you'd like to see to support the investments you're making.
Good afternoon to you and all the other participants. I think it's been a very instructive exercise, and I think all participants have made more or less the same points around that a single digital market for Africa is absolutely critical. It will be enabling, and the speaker from the World Bank did highlight one issue that is of interest to us, is that the development of a single data market, enabling data transfer, cyber security, and in a related issue, the ACFTA will not attain its optimum development unless we have an optimal and an optimized single digital market. And you can speak to all other related issues, trade, energy, that were referenced as connected markets. So from that perspective, it's really been an instructive session. It's we've joined all the dots. Unfortunately, we still have to deal with per country, per region, enablement of everything that has been spoken to. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karabo. And I think the point you're making around the digital data market can unlock massive opportunities. I saw recently the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in Rwanda has just done some work to facilitate cross-border data and as a result are now able to leverage healthcare services for their citizens. So maybe on that point, I know we've got the head of the South African Center, Dr. Sabine, as well as Labisi from the CSIR. if you would like to perhaps just comment around some of the work that's happening and potentially opportunities for further collaboration and integration towards infrastructure development in the region. Dr. Klabisi, are you on the line? If you can just unmute yourself, you can, welcome to share your inputs.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Klabishi at the CSIR. In actual fact, I work closely with Dr. Nziban and Tlatlapa. I was hoping that he will go ahead, but in essence, what we are trying to create at the CSIR, we have a little bit department on the network systems and applications. So our key focus is actually to, for now, we've been looking at new deployment models. We're looking at the ICT, looking at emerging technologies such as Internet of Things, how do we roll out broadband, in the past. And we have been working on the TV white spaces, which has reached almost maturity. It's been rolled out, in the communities, how affordable broadband can be brought about through the TV white space technologies. We are now focusing on the 5G technology. We are building a 5G test bed, and our primary focus is to look at the open protocols and open models. We are looking at the open source, or what we call open radio access network, and together with a combination of other ICT infrastructure core networks which are open. So the idea is to actually, drive the interoperability, between technologies, to also make sure that the cost of deploying infrastructure is actually lower, to enable and also, involve the small players, SMEs. So we are building this infrastructure such that we allow, the National System of Innovation, to do trials, to do testings and testings which will normally be very much expensive. So we are creating that platform to enable that, to ensure that the digitalization efforts of the country, have that concerted efforts with the big players as well as the SMEs. So yeah, thanks very much. And this is what we are working on currently.
Thanks so much, Labisi. And I think, the work done in terms of the research and development, forms a foundation for actually the innovation and unlocking opportunities for us to try different things and be the bridge between the academic and academic world and applications to industry. Let me quickly, if we can, Busisiwe Khaba, if you are on the line, I thought you also wanted to make a contribution from Uber. Busisiwe, if you just want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much, colleagues. Very interesting presentation and very insightful. On the issue of data integration, I think there was one speaker who spoke about it, the API data interface. I found that very interesting, and we seeing this coming up a lot in a lot of African markets and operating outside of South Africa. So that was very insightful, and how to just tackle it. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Busisiwe. And then maybe Taboko from Nashua, if you want to make a quick contribution. Oh, sorry, I think my apologies. I'm trying to keep up with the names on the list and as we move through. Okay, so I think maybe quick, I saw Sunil, you've joined midway through the session from SAP, if you want to perhaps just share with us some of the thinking from SAP's perspective. Sunil, you can just unmute. Okay, I think maybe on that note, we've actually had quite a rich discussion, and maybe as I hand over to Peter for closing remarks and the vote of thanks, just some key aspects that definitely came out is around looking at our infrastructure investments more holistically in terms of understanding the implications from a more broader connectivity perspective, whether we're thinking water, power, understanding the potential to unlock economic growth and, more importantly, jobs, and especially for young people, and in tandem doing that with the skills and the reskilling that needs to take place to support that. I think the point around digital harmonization of policy and frameworks and standards, not just in a country, but across the region, especially to give effect to things like the free trade agreement, are going to be critical. And so I think even the points around the regional approach to the way we do this, and starting to think about how do we support connectivity to potentially unlock data, to unlock and create a digital economy. We need to appreciate that there's building blocks that we need to do this through. So on that note, let me take a moment and thank all of our speakers and panels, just for participation from my side, as I hand over to Peter. Peter?
Thank you so much, Harsha. Thanks so much for your insights and for a slickly run discussion. I won't take much of your time in closing, but just to really appreciate all the insights that we have received. I think possibly the biggest beneficiary has certainly been us at the NBF. We've learned a lot about the sector. We've covered a lot of ground, and we do apologize for being quite a long session. But we had so many different aspects to crowd in here. We hope that our colleagues from outer NEPAD and from SADC Secretariat have found it useful as well to start getting some initial ideas of how we can start to collaborate in the public and private sector side around a regional initiative. I think for me, just in terms of a way forward, what have we noticed? I think everybody acknowledges that digital is a very much a private sector driven sector. So we're taking that lead. We see that SADC particularly has a very strong strategy, and I think a lot was shared on what that strategy is, and includes the activities they're going to be undertaking. I think it is a strong opportunity for us to play a catalytic role in involving the private sector in the execution of those plans. So we will certainly have a follow-up session with SADC Secretariat and outer NEPAD, and understanding how can we support by mobilizing private sector. And I think obviously the World Bank program was very interesting as well. I think there's strong alignment there in terms of what you're trying to do as the bank that aligns with what SADC's trying to do at a regional level. So I think that there is, if nothing else, we've created an ecosystem here today of a network of players that are keen to work together to enable and to execute. So next steps from our side, aside from some of the follow-up discussions, particularly with those stakeholders, we will also put together an output report of this discussion with some key recommendations. We would like to establish, for want of a better word, a mini steering committee around some of the outputs of this discussion. So we'll certainly come back to many of you to start to constitute that steering committee. And the idea would be to see how can we find a catalytic role that the NBF can play within this vast world of digital. I think we will try and find something very surgical where we can add some value and hopefully grow this sector for the benefit of our economies and of our people across the region. So that's it from me. Really just a big thank you again for all involved. Just before I hand back to Amos, a very big thank you to the Nedbank team. A very big thank you to our NBF team who's been working really hard for this in the last couple of months to put it together. And a really big thank you for all of those that have participated today and freely giving of your time. We do appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Over to you, Amos.
Oh, thank you. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we have come
You're
to...
mute, Amos. I'm not the only guilty one today, I'm glad.
Can you hear me now, Peter? Can people hear me? Okay, great stuff. All right. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our fascinating discussion. And I've certainly enjoyed listening to all the speakers and, more importantly, learning a great deal from our experts. As mentioned earlier, this is the first of our quarterly fora. There are 3 more to go that we will communicate them to you in due course. And I'd like to thank the following for making this forum possible. In no particular order, I'd like to thank the NEPAD Business Foundation, led by its chairman, Geoff Rothschild and Peter, the SADC Secretariat, the AUDA NEPAD Agency, the World Bank Group, Siemens, Cisco, Deloitte, Wits University, Digital Council, all our speakers and our moderator, Hasha. I think you did a good job. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I'd like to thank you, the audience. We greatly appreciate you taking time of your busy schedule to be with us today. With that said, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the forum is adjourned and we wish you a productive day further. Thank you very much.